Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. Once upon a time, there stood on the edge of the forest a huge, dark castle. And it was the heart of winter. Snow lay on the ground everywhere and weighed down the trees. And in the castle lived a king and a queen. And one day, the queen was sewing in her bedroom. And she looked at the view, and outside the snow was sparkling on the ground. And she got up close to the window, and the window had an ebony black frame, and the view looked so pretty through that window. And she opened the window, and oof, she pricked her finger with a needle, and a drop of blood fell onto the snow. And she looked at it and said, "Oh, I wish I had a baby daughter with hair as black as ebony, with skin as white as snow, and with lips as red as that drop of blood." And guess what? Her wish came true. Because the next year, she gave birth to a lovely baby girl. "Oh, you are so beautiful," she said. "Look at your hair." And the hair was all soft and black, and your skin creamy white, and little lips as red as blood. "I'm going to call you Snow White," she said. But very sadly, a month or two after the birth, she became ill and she died. And Snow White was brought up by a nanny who really loved her. And all the servants in the palace loved her. So she always had somebody to play with. And she grew up to be such a happy child, always laughing and singing. But the king, who was very busy looking after the country and sometimes going hunting, was lonely. And he decided to get married again. And he married the most stunningly beautiful woman in the whole country. Everybody talked about her beauty. If she went to parties or balls, she always wore a gorgeous outfit. And she had very sharp, blazing green eyes. And her latest outfit was bright green to match her eyes, and it was all shiny like dragon scales. And in her ears she wore emeralds to match, bright green sparkling emeralds. Well, everybody whispered, "Did you see what she was wearing?" But it wasn't enough for her that everybody talked about her beauty. She had to be sure that not only was she beautiful, but the most beautiful woman in the whole kingdom. So every morning she would look into her mirror, a gold-framed mirror on the wall. But it was no ordinary mirror, it was a magic mirror. And she would look into this mirror and say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" And the mirror would always answer, "You, my queen, are the fairest." Good! And then she would start her day. Now, meanwhile, Snow White was growing up in the palace. But the queen didn't like children, so she had very little to do with her. But when Snow White was 7 years old, she was so beautiful and always smiling and laughing. And the queen one day looked at her mirror and asked that question. And the mirror gave her an answer she wasn't expecting. "You are very lovely, my queen. It is true, but the Princess Snow White is 1,000 times lovelier than you." The queen was furious. What sort of face did she make? Very, very angry, like that. In fact, she turned white. She turned green, some people say, with envy. She stamped her foot. She marched up and down. I have to get rid of this brat. She sent for the king's chief huntsman, because he often went hunting in the forest. And she said to him, well, you're good with weapons. There is this brat living in the palace, the king's daughter. She's no good to anyone. I want you to take her to the forest and kill her. Can you imagine how he felt? He was used to hunting animals, killing a child. His heart began to beat fast. Of course, the queen was very scary. Yes, your majesty, he said. And he went off and he went to the kitchen and he asked them to make a picnic of all her favourite foods. And he asked the nanny to bring him Snow White. And Snow White was so happy. Are we going for a walk in the forest? Yes, my dear, he said. So off they went into the forest. Oh, she was so happy to be out. She asked hundreds of questions, like she pointed to an acorn. Oh, is that going to grow into an oak tree? And he nodded. Oh, what's the name of that flower? And he told her. But as they walked, he just knew he could not possibly kill that child. No way. So when they got to the heart of the forest where there was a clearing, he put down a blanket and they sat down. And Snow White said, are we going to have the picnic? And he said, sadly, no, I'm sorry, Snow White. I have to tell you something. It's something hard. Your stepmother wants me to kill you. To kill me? She couldn't believe it. Yes, no, really, she means it, to kill you. Now, I'm not going to do it. What I want you to do is to take off your white jacket, leave it here, and then run. She got up really confused. So he had to shout at her, I mean it, run, run, run. And poor Snow White turned and she began running. And she ran and she ran and she ran. And it was really strange in the forest. She was only 7. She'd never been alone in a forest. And she heard strange noises like stomping and rustling in the bushes. And she guessed that must be wild boar. Now, wild boar aren't like farmyard pigs. They can be pretty angry if you cross their path. So she veered off to the right and ran even faster. And she ran up a hill and down a hill and up a hill and down. And there she saw a very little cottage. People, she thought. I can ask them to shelter me. It was such a lovely little cottage. It had roses growing round the door, and it had a little garden with wild flowers. It was so pretty. So she knocked on the door, but nobody answered. Oh, they must be away. Oh, I'm sure they won't mind. She pushed the door open and she found herself in a room. Very pleasant room with a fireplace. In front of the fireplace was a fireguard. And hanging on the fireguard were 7 pairs of very small socks. Different colours. There was red, orange, yellow, green, blue, pink and purple. And they were all slightly different sizes from each other, but they were very small. And she thought, well, where's the mums and dads' socks? 7 children living on their own, maybe? That was odd. But she opened another door and she found herself in quite a big room with a long polished wood table, but it was very low. And around it were 7 very small chairs, actually too small for her to sit in. But on the table there were 7 little plates and 7 little mugs and forks and knives and spoons. And what was strange was on each little plate was a little picture of a kind of soft peaked hat with a pom-pom, and each one of them different colours like the socks. But there was also food. She was so hungry. She hadn't had her picnic. So on each plate was a roll, but each one had a different size. There was round, there was square, there was plaited, and there was also a square of cheese. Do you like cheese? Some yes, some no. She loved cheese. And there was also vegetables, but different. So on one plate there were 5 mushrooms. On one plate there were 3 little tomatoes, and on another plate 2 baby carrots. And in each mug there was apple juice. So she thought if she just took a little from each plate, nobody would mind too much. So she took a bite out of each roll. She took a knife and cut down the squares of cheese, and she had a piece of cheese from each plate. And she took a mushroom and a carrot and a tomato and a little sip from each mug. Oh, that was better. But then she felt so tired, all that running. And she walked up the stairs and she thought, I'm sure they won't mind. They're probably away. Maybe there's a bed upstairs. And she opened a door to a bedroom. And there was a row of 7 very small beds, all made up with beautiful white sheets and blankets of different colours, just like the socks. She thought, well, she tried one, and it was so small, her legs were kind of hanging over the edge. Oh God, that's not going to work. She tried another. It was so narrow that she rolled off. Oh dear. She tried one after the other until she got to the last one. And the last one was still small but bigger than the others. And she tried it and she thought, oh, well, if I put my knees up and just put my head on the pillow, I think it'll be all... And she fell fast asleep. Well, not long after that, the owners of the house came home. They were 7 very small men. And they had been working all day without a break, digging precious metals out of the rocks in the hillside, gold and silver and copper. And they were tired and they were hungry. And each one of them had, you can probably guess, a little hat with a pom-pom, different colours. They were 7 dwarfs. One of them noticed, the door's slightly open. It's your fault, you're always leaving it open. No, I'm not, said the other. I always tell you, you should lock it. Oh, I don't like locked doors. So they were a bit grumpy, they were so hungry. And they went in. One of them said, I have a funny feeling there's someone here. I don't know how I know, it just feels different. Well, never mind, let's go and eat and see. So they go into the dining room. Wait a minute, someone's moved my chair. Hey, someone's taken a bite from my roll. Someone's used my knife, it's got cheese. Talking about cheese, the cheese has shrunk. My cheese has shrunk, so has mine. I could have sworn I had 5 mushrooms. There are only 4. Where's my tomato? I've only got 1 baby carrot. This is very odd. Well, it was getting dark. So they lit 7 candles and they said, let's search the house, each one of them carrying a candle. And they crept upstairs into the bedroom. Hey, someone's pulled my sheet back. Look, there's a dent in my pillow. Ha! There's a footprint by my bed. They went down all the beds until they came to the last one. There's someone sleeping here. It's a girl. Oh, isn't she pretty? Shall we wake her up? No, she's probably lost in the forest. Let's let her sleep. So they went and they ate their dinner and they came upstairs again, and the 7th dwarf said, well, where am I going to sleep? And all the others said, you can sleep in my bed. Well, they spent the night like this. He slept for 1 hour in one bed, 1 hour in the next bed, 1 hour in the next bed, and so on. All night, an hour in each bed. And it wasn't very comfortable. Hey, your foot's in my ear. Stop kneeing my back. But when they woke up in the morning, they were good-tempered. They smiled at each other. They went downstairs and they cooked some porridge. Don't you think we better wake her? I think so, because we've got to go to work. Come on. So they went upstairs and they all stood around her bed. And she was fast asleep. But you know, sometimes you can feel when someone's looking at you, can't you? Even when you're asleep. So she suddenly opened her eyes. And she looked around and she saw these faces staring down at her. And she was quite scared, but they began to smile. And they really did look very funny. They were so small. One had a nose like a carrot. The other had a nose like an onion. One had a moustache, another had a beard. They all had very big eyes. They were all wearing different colour hats. One was brown skin, one was white skin, one was red. "Well, who are you?" they said. "I'm Snow White." "Well, how did you get here?" And the whole story came tumbling out, all about the forest and the hunter and her stepmother. And so, "I don't know where to go. I mean, could I stay here?" And they looked at each other and they all nodded. But one, the one with a nose like a carrot, said, "Well, if you do the sweeping." And the one with a nose like an onion said, "Well, could you do my job? I don't very much like washing the floors." "Oh, if you do the cooking, if you do the cleaning, if you do the ironing." "But we'll all help you," they said, "because it's too much work for one person." So they started to go to the door to go to work, leaving her to make the beds. But before they left, they all turned round with the same thought. And the one with a beard, the oldest one, said to her, "Snow White, you must be very careful, because your stepmother won't give up. She'll probably come back and try again. So you are not to open the door to anybody. Do you understand?" "Oh yes," said Snow White, "I won't open the door." And off they went to work. Well, Snow White got busy making the beds. But what was happening back at the castle? The hunter pricked his finger with the point of his hunting knife and drew some blood. And he took her little white jacket and he smeared the blood on her jacket, and trembling inside, he brought the jacket to the queen. And he said to the queen, "I killed her, and here's her jacket." And when the queen saw the bloody jacket, she was really pleased. "Good, well done, man," she said. And she slept very well that night. But just to be sure, she looked at her mirror on the wall the next day and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" And the mirror said, "You are lovely, my queen. It is true, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Princess Snow White is alive and well, and 1,000 times lovelier than you." The queen. Can you make the face again? It's even worse this time. Thank you. That's absolutely right. She turned pale. She turned green. She stamped her foot. She marched up and down. "Something has to be done about that brat. The hunter was probably lying to me. What am I going to do? I know. I'm going to sell things. Pretty things like ribbons and bows and buttons and belts and lace and ribbons. Things like that." And she dressed herself up in a disguise, a simple black dress and a white apron and a brown curly wig. And because some people say she had magic, she disguised her face completely. And off she went to the 7 dwarfs' cottage, carrying all her pretty little things. And she knocked on the door. Snow White didn't quite know what to do. She opened it a little crack and said, "Yes? Ah, young lady, I have beautiful things to sell, just the sort of things that a young girl would like. I have lace, I have ribbons, I have belts," because she noticed that Snow White's dress was really loose. "You wouldn't have a red belt, would you?" said Snow White. "As it happens, I do." And she took out a red velvet belt with a gold buckle. "Would you like to try this on, my dear? It would go beautifully on your white dress." "Oh, yes." And the queen wrapped the red belt around Snow White's waist, and she pulled it tight on the buckle, tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. till Snow White collapsed on the ground.
You've breathed your last, said the Queen. And off she went.
But that evening, the dwarfs came back from work.
Oh, I am hungry. Will be nice to have a meal cooked by someone else.
But when the door swung open, they saw poor Snow White right behind the door, lying there, white and lifeless. Oh dear, what is wrong with her? Poor thing. They rubbed her hands. They rubbed her face and her hair. Oh, but suddenly one of them said, look at her waist. It's as thin as a pole. Oh my goodness, it's that belt. Quick, get scissors. One of them rushed off to get scissors. They cut through the belt and she took a deep breath. What happened?
You tell us. You opened the door to someone, didn't you?
Oh, I didn't mean to. It just happened. Oh, I won't do it again.
Please don't. We love you, Snow White.
Back at the castle,
the Queen was very happy for one night, until the next morning she had to speak to her mirror, and the mirror said, 1,000 times lovelier than you. She made that terrible face. She turned, that's good, she turned white. She turned green. She stamped her foot. She stomped up and down. She made her way to her kitchen. Now, if you think that Queen cooked anything, you'd be wrong. She had a cook to do that. But in her kitchen, I'm sorry to tell you, she had poisons of all kinds. Poisons in vases and jars and jugs. Yeah. Lethal poisons. The taste of a tiny drop of one of them, enough to kill another person. So she was thinking to herself, but how can I get Snow White's attention? I noticed her hair was a little bit messy. I bet you those dwarfs don't help her comb her hair. I'll sell hair things. I'll sell lotions and potions, coconut oil, shampoo, slides, combs. And she found in her drawer a beautiful white comb encrusted with pearls. And she dipped this into a bowl of poison and put it in a separate bag, put everything in a rucksack, disguised herself once again, this time in a pretty pink dress and a blonde wig, and made her way through the forest, over the hills, to the dwarf's cottage. And she knocked on the door. And this time, Snow White came to the window and looked out and said, sorry, I can't open the door. Oh, well, never mind. Maybe open the window a crack. So she opened the window just a crack. My dear, it seems to me a long time since anybody combed your hair. I don't even have a comb with me, said Snow White. I have all sorts of lovely things for your hair, said the old lady. What about this? And she held up a beautiful comb, the one I told you about, encrusted with pearls. Snow White's eyes opened wide. Her nanny had combed her hair every night and brushed it until it shone. And to be honest, those dwarfs weren't very good with hair, and neither was she. Would you like me to comb your hair? Said the woman. Oh, yes, please. Well, poke your head through the window. Snow White poked her head through the window, and the woman began to comb and comb. Oh, it felt so nice to have her hair combed. It was lovely, until suddenly the woman stabbed her head hard with a comb. And Snow White, the poison getting to her head, fell down in a dead faint. Ha ha, said the Queen. You won't be combing your hair again. And off she went. And that evening the dwarfs came home. And once again they searched what was making her ill. They looked to see what she'd eaten or drunk. They stroked her hair and oh, there was the comb. Quickly they pulled it out. Snow White took a deep breath. What happened, she said. You tell us. And once again she had to tell them she'd got it wrong. And once again they said, Snow White, we love you. Don't open door or window to anyone.
I won't."
Meanwhile, the queen, back in the castle, slept a good night's sleep. But next morning, mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all? You are very lovely, my queen, it is true. But over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Princess Snow White is alive and well, and 1,000 times more beautiful than you. 1,000 times. She turned white. That's right. She turned grey. She turned green. She stamped her foot. She stomped up and down. Once again, she made her way to the kitchen and looked at her poisons. I know, she thought. I know, it's apple picking time. Apples. She told her servant to bring her a few apples. She put them all in a basket, but she took one, which was juicy red on one side and white on the other, and she injected just the red side with poison. She then dressed up as a farmer, in an old faded dress and a white apron and a scarf around her head, and she stained her face brown so it would look like she worked outdoors, and she made her way to the dwarf's cottage. And she went and knocked on the window. Snow White came to the window, didn't know what to do. And the woman showed her this basket of lovely apples and pointed to them. "It's my crop," she said. "I've got too many. I'm just handing them out all around. Would you like some?" Snow White shook her head. "Oh, come on, they're lovely. Just taste one." And she brought out that juicy looking red apple, and Snow White shook her head. "It's a good apple. I'll take a bite." And she took a bite from the white side that wasn't poisoned. She took a big bite, crunch, 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 swallowed it. "It's good, it's good. Take a bite, just taste." Oh, it looked so juicy and good, and Snow White hadn't had an apple yet this autumn. Oh, she couldn't help it. And the woman was so nice with that big smile. She opened the window. She leant out, she took the apple, she bit deep into the red side, chewed, began to swallow, and fell down dead on the floor by the window. "Dead as a doornail," said the queen. "May you rot." And off she went, back to her castle. The 7 dwarfs came back that evening. They patted her face, they stroked her hair, they tried to give her a drink. Nothing would revive her. She was dead. They cried for 7 days, just sitting round her where she lay on the floor. And then they had a glass box, a glass coffin made specially for her. And they lifted her up. She still looked so lovely. And they put her in the glass coffin. And all 7 dwarves carried that glass coffin up the hill to where there was a stone ledge just near the top of the hill. And they put it there and they wrote with gold paint, "Here lies the lovely Princess Snow White." And there was always one dwarf watching the coffin. And people used to come by on the path and ask, "Who is this lovely dead woman who looks alive, who's so beautiful?" Because the years were passing, she had grown into a lovely woman, but she was dead. It was very, very strange. But back in the castle, every day for years, the queen was saying, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the loveliest of us all?" And every day the mirror was answering, "You, my queen, are the loveliest of all." This went on, as I said, for years and years. But back on the mountain one day, a young prince was riding by with his servants. And he stopped to look at the coffin. And he got out of his horse, and he can't believe that this lovely young woman lying there in the glass box is dead. His heart goes out to her, poor woman. And he says to the dwarf,
Please tell me something of her story. And the dwarf told him, and he said, I can't bear to part from her. Can I take her home with me? Oh no, said the dwarf. I'll pay you large amounts of money just to have her with me, not for money. But what about my heart? It's love, not money. That's what it's really about. My heart goes out to her. That made the dwarf think. He said, I'll ask my friends. And he asked the other 6. And they all said yes. And so the prince asked his servants to pick up the coffin very, very gently and to carry it down the hill. And they walked as carefully as they could, but there were rocks in the hill, and one servant tripped up. Oh! And Snow White had a piece of apple lodged in her throat, and suddenly, with a jolting of the coffin, it shifted, and she woke up, and she pushed the lid off the coffin and sat up. Where am I? And the prince couldn't believe his ears. He put out a hand. You're here with me, come. Who are you? I'll tell you. And he helped her step out of the coffin. He sat her down. He gave her food. He gave her drink. She told him her story. He told her where he lived. And after not too long, they fell in love. And he asked her, would she come back with him to his palace, to his parents? And she willingly agreed. And soon, even on the journey back, they decided they were going to get married. And his parents were delighted. And they planned the wedding, and they sent out invitations. Of course, the first people they invited were the 7 dwarfs. But then, you might be surprised to know, they sent an invitation to the queen. Now years had passed. Snow White was grown up. When the queen saw that invitation, please come to the wedding of the prince and the princess Snow White, she turned pale. She turned green. She didn't know what to think. Well, what should she do? She ran to a magic mirror. And her magic mirror said, you, my queen, are very lovely. It is true. But the bride, Snow White, is 1,000 times lovelier than you. She didn't know what to do. How could she not go? She had to go. She had to see. She had people sew her the most beautiful white dress, just to compete with a bride, covered in sequins and pearls and diamonds. And she and her husband, the king, set off in a coach and horses for the wedding. But when she got to the wedding, everybody was looking at Snow White and the prince and clapping and laughing because Snow White was so lovely. She was wearing a simple white dress, but her smile was so lovely. Her laughter was so lovely. Nobody looked at anyone else. Nobody noticed what the queen was wearing. Nobody was interested in the queen. Maybe it's because she had such a very sour face. But this was so terrible, nobody looking at her, that she fled, leaving her husband behind. She jumped in her carriage, she whipped the horses and went straight back to her own castle. She ran up the stairs, shut herself in her room, locked the door, and was never seen in public again. But the prince and Snow White lived happily ever after.